Sarah Martinez wiped the dust from her tactical goggles as the helicopter's rotors finally stopped spinning. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of artillery fire echoing across the desert landscape. She stepped onto the cracked concrete of what had once been a thriving military outpost, now reduced to rubble and twisted metal after 3 days of relentless bombardment. The mission briefing had been clear but grim. Intelligence reports suggested that a team of 6 Navy SEALs had been conducting a reconnaissance operation in this sector when enemy forces overran their position. Communication had been lost 48 hours ago, and satellite imagery showed the compound had been heavily damaged. The official rescue mission had been called off after aerial reconnaissance detected no signs of life. But Sarah wasn't here on an official mission. As a combat medic with 10 years of experience in hostile territories, she had served alongside these men in Afghanistan, Iraq, and countless other operations that would never make the evening news. When she heard through back channels that the military had written them off as casualties, something inside her refused to accept it. She knew these SEALs better than their own families did. She had patched their wounds, shared their rations during long desert nights, and watched them pull off impossible extractions when everyone else had given up hope. The compound stretched before her like a concrete graveyard. Buildings that had once housed hundreds of personnel now stood as hollow shells, their windows blown out and walls pockmarked with bullet holes. Debris littered the courtyard, and the acrid smell of smoke still hung heavy in the air. Sarah adjusted her medical pack and checked her sidearm. She had managed to convince a sympathetic helicopter pilot to drop her at the edge of the facility, but from here on, she was completely alone. Moving carefully through the ruins, Sarah's trained eyes scanned for any sign of the missing team. The intelligence reports had placed them in the eastern sector of the compound, near what had been the communications building. As she picked her way through the rubble-strewn corridors, memories flooded back of the countless times these same SEALs had risked everything to bring wounded soldiers home. Now it was her turn to do the same for them. The communications building had taken a direct hit from what appeared to be a rocket-propelled grenade. The entire second floor had collapsed, creating a maze of twisted steel and concrete chunks. Sarah began the painstaking process of searching through the debris, calling out softly for any sign of her teammates. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat mixed with dust as she climbed over fallen beams and squeezed through narrow gaps in the wreckage. Hours passed without any response to her calls. Sarah's water supply was running low, and the weight of her medical equipment was beginning to take its toll. But just as doubt began to creep into her mind, she heard something that made her heart skip a beat. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the settling sounds of the damaged building, but unmistakably human. Someone was tapping against metal in a rhythmic pattern. Following the sound deeper into the ruins, Sarah found herself in what had once been the building's basement. The ceiling had partially collapsed, but a pocket of space remained near the far wall. The tapping was definitely coming from behind a pile of concrete blocks. Working frantically, Sarah began moving smaller pieces of debris, calling out to whoever was trapped behind the makeshift wall. A weak voice answered back. It was Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, the team's communications specialist. Sarah's hands worked faster now, adrenaline giving her strength she didn't know she possessed. Within 30 minutes, she had cleared enough debris to reach Rodriguez, who was barely conscious and suffering from what appeared to be a severe concussion and a badly broken arm. As Sarah administered emergency medical care, Rodriguez managed to whisper crucial information between labored breaths. The rest of the team was alive but trapped in an underground bunker system that connected to the building's foundation. They had been using the old Cold War-era tunnels to evade enemy patrols, but a series of explosions had sealed most of the entrances. Rodriguez had been trying to dig his way out to establish communications when the final bombardment brought down the ceiling. With Rodriguez stabilized as much as possible given the circumstances, Sarah faced her first major decision. She could attempt to evacuate him immediately, but that would mean abandoning the search for the other 5 SEALs. Alternatively, she could continue the rescue operation, but Rodriguez's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and he needed proper medical attention within hours to survive. Rodriguez, despite his injuries, made the choice for her. With tremendous effort, he pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his tactical vest. It was a hand-drawn map of the tunnel system, marking where the team had last been positioned. He pressed it into Sarah's hands and insisted she leave him behind to find the others. The team had been without food or water for over 2 days, and at least one member had suffered serious injuries in the initial attack. Sarah spent precious minutes creating a makeshift shelter for Rodriguez, using debris to protect him from potential enemy patrols while ensuring he had access to fresh air. She left him with pain medication and most of her remaining water, knowing that her decision might cost him his life but could save 5 others. It was the kind of impossible choice that combat medics faced regularly, but it never became easier. The tunnel entrance Rodriguez had marked on his map was located beneath what had been the compound's motor pool. The garage had suffered heavy damage, with several vehicles crushed under collapsed roof sections. Sarah had to move 3 separate car-sized chunks of concrete before she could access the tunnel opening. The entrance itself was partially blocked by debris, requiring her to crawl on her stomach through a space barely wide enough for her shoulders. The darkness inside the tunnel was absolute. Sarah activated her tactical flashlight and began the slow process of navigating the underground passage. The map indicated that the tunnel system extended nearly a quarter-mile beneath the compound, with multiple branches and dead ends. The SEALs had chosen a position roughly halfway through the system, at a junction where 4 tunnels met. As Sarah crawled through the confined space, she became acutely aware of how precarious her situation had become. If the tunnels collapsed or if enemy forces discovered her presence, there would be no way for anyone to mount a rescue operation. She was completely cut off from outside communication, and no one knew her exact location. The weight of that isolation pressed down on her as heavily as the tons of concrete and earth above her head. The tunnel system showed signs of recent occupation. Sarah found empty MRE packages, makeshift bandages made from torn uniforms, and spent ammunition casings scattered along the passage. The SEALs had clearly been using this space as both shelter and a fighting position. But, as Sarah progressed deeper into the tunnels, the signs of habitation became less frequent, replaced by an ominous silence that suggested either the team had moved to another location or something terrible had happened. After nearly 2 hours of crawling through increasingly unstable passages, Sarah finally reached the junction marked on Rodriguez's map. Her flashlight beam revealed a slightly larger chamber where the 4 tunnels converged. But, instead of finding her missing teammates, she discovered evidence of a fierce firefight. Bullet holes scarred the tunnel walls, and dark stains on the concrete floor suggested that someone had been seriously wounded. Fresh concern gripped Sarah as she examined the scene more carefully. Blood trails led down 2 of the 4 tunnel branches, indicating that the team had been forced to split up during whatever engagement had occurred here. The amount of blood suggested that at least one person had been critically injured, possibly fatally wounded. Sarah now faced the prospect of tracking multiple groups through an increasingly dangerous underground maze. Choosing the tunnel with the most recent blood trail, Sarah continued her desperate search. The passage began to slope downward, leading deeper underground. The air grew thicker and more humid, suggesting that this section of the tunnel system might connect to the compound's water management infrastructure. Sarah's medical training told her that wounded men would seek water sources instinctively, making this the most logical path to follow. The tunnel eventually opened into a larger chamber that had once been part of the compound's underground storage facility. Sarah's flashlight revealed rows of empty shelving units and several large water tanks. But, more importantly, she could hear voices echoing from somewhere deeper in the chamber. Moving cautiously toward the sound, Sarah finally found what she had been searching for since landing at the compound hours earlier. 3 of the missing SEALs were huddled around a wounded teammate in a corner of the storage chamber. Lieutenant James Thompson, the team leader, looked up in amazement as Sarah's light illuminated his face. Beside him, Sergeants David Chen and Marcus Williams were tending to Petty Officer First Class Kevin O'Brien, who had suffered a severe gunshot wound to his abdomen. The team sniper, Staff Sergeant Alex Turner, was nowhere to be seen. Thompson quickly explained that Turner had been separated from the group during the firefight at the tunnel junction. He had volunteered to create a diversion, drawing enemy fire away from the wounded O'Brien while the others carried him to safety. That had been over 6 hours ago, and they had heard sporadic gunfire from various parts of the tunnel system since then. Turner was either still evading capture somewhere in the underground maze or had been killed attempting to rejoin his team. Sarah immediately began assessing O'Brien's condition while listening to Thompson's account of the past 3 days. The team had been conducting surveillance on enemy supply routes when their position was compromised by a local informant. They had fought a running battle through the compound as overwhelming enemy forces closed in from all sides. The tunnel system had offered temporary sanctuary, but they were effectively trapped with limited ammunition and no way to call for extraction. O'Brien's wound was serious but not immediately life-threatening if treated properly. The bullet had passed through his lower abdomen without hitting major organs, but infection was a growing concern, and he had lost significant blood. Sarah began the delicate process of cleaning and redressing the wound while the other SEALs described the layout of the remaining tunnel sections and their best guess at Turner's probable location. As Sarah worked, Thompson made it clear that the team would not consider evacuation without Turner. It was the same code that had brought Sarah to this place in the first place. No one gets left behind, regardless of the personal cost or the official orders from command. Sarah found herself admiring these men even more than she had during their previous operations together. Even trapped in an underground maze, wounded and exhausted, they maintained the brotherhood that defined the special operations community. The sound of distant explosions reminded everyone that the compound above remained contested territory. Enemy patrols continued to search the ruins, and it was only a matter of time before they discovered the tunnel entrances. Sarah realized that she had to find Turner quickly and get everyone out of the underground system before their sanctuary became their tomb. The clock was ticking, and every minute that passed reduced their chances of a successful extraction. Sarah made the difficult decision to split her medical supplies, leaving enough with the team to keep O'Brien stable while she searched for Turner. Thompson initially resisted, arguing that it was too dangerous for her to continue alone. But Sarah pointed out that she was the only one mobile enough to navigate the tunnels quickly and that Turner might need immediate medical attention when found. Before leaving to search for the missing sniper, Sarah administered pain medication to O'Brien and showed Chen and Williams how to monitor his vital signs and watch for dangerous changes in his condition. She promised to return within 2 hours, whether she found Turner or not. If she failed to return, Thompson was to attempt an evacuation of his wounded teammate through the tunnel system's eastern exit, which connected to a drainage culvert outside the compound's perimeter. As Sarah prepared to venture deeper into the tunnel network, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out for all of them. The enemy forces above were systematic and patient, and they would eventually discover the underground passages. When that happened, the tunnels would become a trap rather than a refuge. Sarah checked her sidearm one final time and began crawling toward the sections of the tunnel system where Turner was most likely to be found, knowing that this could be her last chance to bring all of the SEALs home alive. The section of tunnel that Sarah entered was noticeably different from the passages she had navigated earlier. The walls were older, constructed from rough-hewn stone rather than the modern concrete of the upper levels. This appeared to be part of the original fortification that had been built on this site decades earlier, before the current military compound was constructed above it. The ceiling was lower here, forcing Sarah to move in a painful crouch that put tremendous strain on her back and legs. Sarah's flashlight beam revealed disturbing signs as she progressed through the ancient passages. Fresh scratches on the stone walls suggested that someone had been moving through this area recently, but the marks were irregular and desperate-looking, as if made by someone who was injured or disoriented. She also found small drops of blood on the tunnel floor, forming a sporadic trail that led deeper into the underground labyrinth. The air in these lower tunnels was thick and stagnant, carrying the musty smell of earth and decay. Sarah's breathing became labored as she pushed forward, following the blood trail through a series of tight passages that seemed to wind endlessly through the foundation of the compound. Several times she was forced to squeeze through openings barely wide enough for her body, scraping her elbows and knees raw against the rough stone. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Sarah heard the sound that had been haunting her since entering the tunnels, the distant echo of voices speaking in a foreign language. Enemy forces had discovered at least one entrance to the underground system and were beginning their own search operation. The voices were still far away, but sound carried strangely in the confined spaces, making it difficult to determine exactly how close the danger might be. Sarah switched off her flashlight and continued moving through the darkness, relying on touch to guide her along the tunnel walls. The blood trail was impossible to follow without light, but she hoped that Turner had continued moving away from the main tunnel entrances, just as she was doing. The ancient passages seemed to extend much farther than the newer sections, possibly connecting to natural cave systems in the underlying bedrock. Moving silently through the pitch-black tunnels required intense concentration. Every sound seemed amplified in the confined space, from the soft scrape of her clothing against the stone walls to the rhythmic drip of water somewhere in the distance. Sarah forced herself to breathe slowly and quietly while straining to hear any indication that Turner might be nearby. The enemy voices had faded, but that could mean either that they had moved away or that they were maintaining silence while conducting their own search. Sarah's hand suddenly encountered something unexpected on the tunnel wall, carved letters cut deep into the stone. Running her fingers over the markings, she could make out what appeared to be initials and dates spanning several decades. This tunnel had clearly been used by military personnel for much longer than the current compound had existed. Some of the dates went back to the 1950s, suggesting that these passages had served as shelter or storage areas during the region's various conflicts. One carving was noticeably fresher than the others. Sarah risked turning on her flashlight for just a moment, shielding the beam with her hand to minimize the visible light. The letters AT were scratched into the stone along with an arrow pointing deeper into the tunnel system. Alex Turner had been here and was leaving a trail for anyone who might be following. Following Turner's markers, Sarah found herself descending through a natural cave system that had been incorporated into the artificial tunnel network. The walls here were rough limestone, carved by underground water flow over countless years. The floor was uneven and treacherous, forcing Sarah to move slowly to avoid serious injury in the darkness. But Turner's trail markers continued to appear at regular intervals, carved into the cave walls with what was probably his combat knife. The cave system eventually opened into a larger chamber where Sarah could finally stand upright for the first time in over an hour. The relief was immediate and overwhelming, but she forced herself to remain focused on the mission. Turner's markers led across the chamber to another tunnel opening on the far side. But, as Sarah began to cross the open space, her flashlight beam revealed something that made her heart stop. Turner was there, but he was not alone. The SEAL sniper was crouched behind a fallen boulder near the center of the chamber, his rifle trained on two enemy soldiers who were searching the far side of the cave. The soldiers had obviously discovered the tunnel entrance and were systematically exploring the cave system. Turner had the tactical advantage of position and surprise, but engaging two armed men in the confined space would be extremely dangerous for both of them. Sarah quickly assessed the situation while remaining hidden at the chamber entrance. Turner appeared to be uninjured but was clearly exhausted from hours of evading pursuit through the tunnel network. The two enemy soldiers were armed with assault rifles and seemed to be conducting a methodical search rather than pursuing a specific target. They had not yet discovered Turner's position, but it was only a matter of time before their search pattern brought them close enough to spot him. Moving with the careful precision that had kept her alive through dozens of combat operations, Sarah began circling around the edge of the chamber, staying in the shadows beyond the reach of the enemy's flashlight beams. Her medical training had included extensive instruction in combat tactics, and she understood how to move silently through hostile territory. But engaging armed combatants was far outside her normal responsibilities, and the weight of that knowledge pressed heavily on her mind. Sarah managed to position herself behind the two soldiers, but she was still faced with the problem of how to neutralize the threat without alerting other enemy forces who might be nearby. Her sidearm would be effective at close range, but the sound of gunfire would echo through the tunnel system and potentially draw more enemies to their location. She needed a solution that would be both silent and decisive. Turner had apparently reached the same conclusion about the need for stealth. As Sarah watched, he began moving slowly from his position behind the boulder, approaching the enemy soldiers with his combat knife drawn rather than his rifle. The years of specialized training were evident in his movement. He covered the distance across the uneven cave floor without making a sound that carried over the echo of the soldiers' own footsteps. Sarah realized that she could provide crucial support for Turner's assault by creating a distraction at the critical moment. Picking up a loose stone from the cave floor, she threw it toward the tunnel entrance where she had first entered the chamber. The sound of the rock striking the wall drew the attention of both enemy soldiers, causing them to turn away from Turner's approach vector. Turner moved with lethal efficiency. The first soldier went down silently, never knowing what hit him. But the second soldier began to turn back toward Turner's position, and Sarah knew that the element of surprise was about to be lost. Without conscious thought, she found herself moving forward, her own combat knife in hand, closing the distance to the remaining threat. The engagement lasted less than 30 seconds. When it was over, both enemy soldiers were dead, and the cave chamber was silent once again. Turner looked at Sarah with a mixture of surprise and gratitude, but there was no time for extended conversation. The soldiers' absence would be noticed soon, and other enemy forces would come looking for them. Turner and Sarah had to get back to the rest of the team and evacuate the tunnel system immediately. Turner quickly explained that he had been moving through the tunnel network for hours, trying to find an alternate exit route while staying ahead of enemy search parties. He had discovered that the cave system connected to a natural spring about half a mile from the compound. The spring emptied into a wadi that provided concealed movement toward a road where extraction might be possible. But the route required crossing through several sections of tunnel that were unstable and potentially impassable for wounded personnel. As they began the journey back toward the rest of the team, Turner revealed information that changed everything about their situation. During his reconnaissance of the tunnel system, he had overheard radio communications between enemy commanders. The compound was scheduled for complete destruction by artillery bombardment in less than 4 hours. The enemy forces were conducting one final search of the underground areas before withdrawing to a safe distance and leveling the entire facility. This meant that even if Sarah could successfully treat the wounded team members and guide everyone through the tunnel system to the natural exit Turner had found, they would still need to cover significant ground across open desert terrain while carrying at least one seriously injured man. O'Brien's abdominal wound made rapid movement extremely difficult, and Rodriguez, if he was still alive, would also require assistance. Sarah felt the weight of leadership settling on her shoulders as they navigated back through the dangerous tunnel network. She was no longer just a combat medic responding to a rescue call, she had become the person responsible for planning and executing an evacuation operation that would determine whether 6 Navy SEALs lived or died. The magnitude of that responsibility was almost overwhelming, but her training and her commitment to these men gave her the strength to continue. The journey back to the team's position took nearly an hour, as Sarah and Turner were forced to take a longer route to avoid areas where enemy forces might still be conducting searches. They moved in complete darkness most of the time, relying on Turner's knowledge of the tunnel layout and Sarah's memory of the path she had taken earlier. The sound of voices and footsteps echoed through the passages several times, forcing them to remain motionless inside passages until the danger passed. When they finally reached the storage chamber where the rest of the team was waiting, Sarah was relieved to find that O'Brien's condition had remained stable. Chen and Williams had followed her instructions perfectly, monitoring the wounded man's vital signs and keeping him hydrated with their remaining water supplies. But Thompson immediately recognized the urgency in Sarah and Turner's manner and demanded to know what they had learned during their reconnaissance. Turner's report about the scheduled artillery bombardment sent shockwaves through the small group. Everyone understood that they now faced a race against time that would test every skill they possessed as special operations personnel. The tunnel system that had provided sanctuary was about to become a death trap, and their only hope lay in reaching Turner's alternate exit before the bombardment began. Sarah took charge of the evacuation planning while Turner worked with Thompson to determine the best route through the unstable sections of the tunnel system. O'Brien would need to be carried on an improvised stretcher, which meant that 2 team members would be occupied with his transport at all times. Sarah would also need to return to Rodriguez's position to attempt his evacuation, adding another variable to an already complex operation. The team had limited resources for the evacuation. Their ammunition supplies were nearly exhausted after 3 days of sporadic combat. Food and water were gone completely. Medical supplies were reduced to what Sarah had brought with her and what little remained in the team's individual first aid kits. Most critically, they had no way to communicate with outside forces to arrange for extraction once they reached the surface. Sarah made the painful decision that they could not attempt to evacuate Rodriguez during the initial movement to Turner's exit point. His injuries were too severe for transport through the unstable tunnel sections, and the risk of losing additional team members in a rescue attempt was too high. She would return for him after the main group reached safety, assuming that time and circumstances permitted. The improvised stretcher for O'Brien was constructed from pieces of equipment webbing and a salvaged piece of metal sheeting from the storage chamber. It was crude but functional, designed to allow two people to carry the wounded man through the narrow tunnel passages. Turner and Chen would serve as the primary stretcher bearers, with Williams and Thompson providing security and route guidance. As the team prepared to move out, Sarah conducted a final medical check of O'Brien's condition. His vital signs were weak but stable, and the bleeding from his abdominal wound had been controlled. But the stress of movement through the tunnel system would put tremendous strain on his injured body, and Sarah had serious concerns about his ability to survive the evacuation. She administered the last of her pain medication and prepared additional bandages in case the wound reopened during transport. The first section of their evacuation route led back through the tunnel passages where Sarah had initially found the team. This area was familiar territory, but it was also the most likely place to encounter enemy search parties. Turner took point position, moving ahead of the main group to scout for threats while maintaining visual contact with Thompson, who was following 50 meters behind. Progress was slower than anyone had hoped. The improvised stretcher was difficult to maneuver through the narrow passages, and O'Brien's condition deteriorated noticeably after the first hour of movement. Sarah was forced to call several rest stops to check his vital signs and adjust his position on the stretcher. Each delay reduced their chances of reaching the exit before the scheduled bombardment, but moving too quickly risked killing the man they were trying to save. The tunnel system grew increasingly unstable as they moved toward Turner's alternate exit route. Several passages showed signs of recent collapse, and loose rocks fell from the ceiling as the group passed underneath. Sarah began to understand why this route had not been used during the team's initial entry into the underground system. It was passable for desperate personnel, but barely safe under the best of circumstances. Halfway to their destination, the group encountered the most dangerous obstacle of their underground journey. A section of tunnel had partially collapsed, leaving an opening that was barely large enough for a single person to squeeze through. The stretcher would not fit, which meant that O'Brien would have to be moved through the gap separately and the stretcher would have to be reconstructed on the other side. Turner volunteered to go through first and secure the area beyond the collapse. Sarah followed, carrying her medical supplies and the materials needed to rebuild the stretcher. Then came the delicate process of moving O'Brien through the narrow opening while maintaining pressure on his abdominal wound and protecting him from further injury. Williams and Chen pushed from behind while Sarah and Turner pulled from the front, guiding the wounded man through the jagged gap in the collapsed tunnel. O'Brien lost consciousness during the passage through the collapse zone. Sarah worked frantically to stabilize him while Turner and the others reconstructed the stretcher. His pulse was weak and irregular, and Sarah suspected that internal bleeding had resumed despite her efforts to control it. Time was running out for the wounded SEAL, and they were still at least an hour away from the tunnel exit. The final section of their underground journey led through the natural cave system where Sarah and Turner had encountered the enemy soldiers earlier. The bodies had been moved, indicating that other enemy forces had discovered the scene and were now actively searching for the Americans who had been responsible. Turner led the group past the location quickly, but everyone understood that their presence in the tunnel system was no longer a secret. As they approached Turner's alternate exit point, the sound of artillery fire from the compound became noticeably louder. The enemy bombardment had begun early, and the tunnel system was starting to vibrate from the impacts above. Dust and small rocks fell continuously from the ceiling, and several larger collapses occurred in passages behind them. The underground sanctuary that had protected the SEALs for 3 days was finally being destroyed, and they were racing to escape before being buried alive. Turner's exit point turned out to be a natural opening in a hillside about 300 meters from the compound's perimeter. The opening was concealed by vegetation and large rocks, making it nearly invisible from more than a few meters away. But, as the team emerged into daylight for the first time in days, they faced a new set of challenges that would test their ability to survive in the open desert while carrying a critically wounded teammate. The late afternoon sun struck Sarah's face like a physical blow as she emerged from the underground cave system. After hours in the artificial twilight of the tunnels, the brightness was overwhelming, forcing her to squint through tears as her eyes slowly adjusted to the desert landscape. The compound behind them was now completely obscured by thick columns of black smoke rising from multiple fires, and the continuous thunder of artillery impacts made conversation impossible without shouting. Turner had chosen the exit point well. The hillside provided natural concealment from enemy observation posts, and the terrain sloped away toward a wadi system that would offer covered movement for at least the first mile of their escape route. But Sarah's medical assessment of O'Brien revealed the harsh reality of their situation. The wounded SEAL was dying, and carrying him across miles of open desert might be beyond their capabilities. O'Brien had lost consciousness again during the final approach to the exit, and his breathing had become shallow and irregular. Sarah's examination revealed that his abdominal wound was bleeding internally despite her efforts to control it during the underground evacuation. His skin was pale and cold to the touch, classic signs of severe blood loss and shock. Without immediate surgical intervention and blood transfusion, he would not survive more than a few hours. Thompson gathered the team for a quick tactical conference while Sarah continued working on O'Brien. The team leader's assessment of their situation was brutally honest. They were at least 15 miles from any possible friendly territory, they had no communications equipment, minimal ammunition, no food or water, and one critically wounded teammate. Enemy forces controlled all the roads and were actively searching the area with both ground patrols and helicopter overflights. But Turner had discovered something during his reconnaissance that offered a slim hope of survival. The wadi system they were about to enter connected to a larger drainage network that led toward an abandoned mining operation in the mountains. Intelligence reports from previous missions had indicated that the mine complex included underground facilities that might provide shelter. More importantly, Turner believed there was a possibility that old communication equipment might still be functional at the site. Sarah faced another impossible decision as she listened to the team's evacuation options. O'Brien needed immediate medical attention that she could not provide with her limited field supplies. Attempting to carry him 15 miles across hostile territory would almost certainly result in his death and might cost the lives of other team members. But leaving him behind violated every principle that defined the special operations community. O'Brien made the decision for her. During a brief moment of consciousness, he grabbed Sarah's hand and whispered instructions that sent chills through everyone within hearing distance. He ordered the team to leave him with enough ammunition to make a final stand and continue the evacuation without him. It was the same request that Rodriguez had made in the tunnel system, and Sarah found herself facing the reality that these men would rather die fighting than compromise their teammates' chances of survival. Thompson immediately rejected O'Brien's request, but Sarah understood that they were facing a situation where traditional military solutions might not be sufficient. As a combat medic, she had taken an oath to preserve life at any cost. But, as someone who had served alongside these SEALs through multiple operations, she also understood that sometimes survival required choices that conflicted with normal medical protocols. After a heated discussion that consumed precious minutes while enemy forces continued to close in on their position, Sarah proposed a compromise plan that addressed both the medical reality and the team's commitment to bringing everyone home. They would attempt to move O'Brien as far as possible toward the mining complex, but if his condition deteriorated beyond a survivable level, they would establish a defensive position and fight rather than abandon him. The team began moving immediately, with Turner taking point and Thompson providing rear security while Chan and Williams carried O'Brien on the reconstructed stretcher. Sarah stayed close to the wounded man, monitoring his condition and providing medical support during movement. The wadi provided excellent concealment, but the rocky terrain made stretcher transport extremely difficult. Within the first hour of movement, the team encountered their first serious obstacle. The wadi system was blocked by a rockfall that had occurred during recent rains, forcing them to climb out of the drainage channel and cross open ground for nearly half a mile. This exposed them to potential observation from enemy aircraft and ground patrols, but there was no alternative route that would allow stretcher transport. Turner climbed to a vantage point and conducted surveillance of the surrounding area while the rest of the team prepared for the dangerous crossing. His report was not encouraging. Enemy helicopter patrols were conducting systematic searches of the desert terrain, and at least 2 ground patrols were moving along roads that paralleled their intended route. Timing the crossing to avoid detection would require precise coordination and significant luck. Sarah used the forced halt to conduct another medical assessment of O'Brien. His condition had deteriorated significantly during the first hour of movement, and she was now certain that he was bleeding internally at a rate that would prove fatal within hours. The rough handling required for stretcher transport over rocky terrain was accelerating the bleeding, and there was nothing she could do to stop it with her available medical supplies. O'Brien was conscious enough to understand Sarah's assessment when she whispered the situation to him. His response was characteristic of the man she had come to know during previous operations. He smiled weakly and told her to keep the team moving toward safety. He also revealed information that changed their tactical situation dramatically. During the firefight in the tunnels, he had managed to send a coded message on their emergency radio before the equipment was destroyed. He believed that friendly forces knew their general location and were attempting to organize a rescue operation. This news provided both hope and additional pressure for the evacuation. If rescue forces were indeed searching for them, reaching a defensible position with good communications potential became even more critical. But it also meant that enemy forces might have intercepted the transmission and could be concentrating their search efforts in this area. The team's movement across the open ground was a testament to their specialized training and experience. Turner guided them along a route that used every available piece of terrain for concealment, while Thompson coordinated their movement to avoid skylining on ridges or creating dust clouds that might attract attention. The stretcher team moved in careful stages, stopping frequently to listen for aircraft and adjusting their route to avoid areas where enemy patrols might have observation. Halfway across the exposed terrain, they encountered a problem that nearly ended their escape attempt. An enemy helicopter appeared without warning from behind a ridgeline, conducting a low-level search pattern that brought it directly over their position. The team had perhaps 30 seconds to find concealment before the aircraft's crew would be close enough to spot them against the desert floor. Turner made a split-second decision that probably saved all their lives. Instead of seeking individual concealment, he directed the team to a depression in the ground where they could huddle together and cover themselves with their equipment. Sarah pulled a camouflage tarp over O'Brien and the stretcher while the other team members used clothing and gear to break up their human outlines against the rocky ground. The helicopter passed directly overhead at an altitude of less than 50 feet. Sarah could see the crew members scanning the terrain through the aircraft's open doors, and she was certain that they had been spotted. But the combination of their concealment and Turner's knowledge of enemy search patterns proved effective. The helicopter continued its patrol pattern without changing course or signaling that targets had been detected. After the aircraft moved out of the immediate area, the team resumed movement with increased urgency. The enemy search was becoming more intensive, and it was only a matter of time before ground patrols reached their position. O'Brien's condition was continuing to deteriorate, and Sarah was forced to stop every few hundred meters to check his pulse and breathing. Each medical check confirmed that time was running out for all of them. The Wadi system resumed beyond the rockfall obstacle, providing welcomed concealment for the next phase of their movement. But Sarah's examination of O'Brien revealed that he had entered the final stages of shock from blood loss. His skin was now gray and clammy, his breathing was rapid and shallow, and his pulse was weak and irregular. Without immediate surgical intervention, he would not survive another hour of transport. Sarah called a halt to explain O'Brien's condition to the rest of the team. Her medical assessment was clear and uncompromising. Continuing to move him was hastening his death without improving their tactical situation. The team needed to make a decision about whether to establish a defensive position here or to continue movement toward the mining complex without the wounded SEAL. The team's discussion was brief but intense. Every man understood the implications of Sarah's medical assessment, and everyone recognized that their window of opportunity for escape was closing rapidly. Enemy forces were converging on their area, and their own physical condition was deteriorating from exhaustion, dehydration, and the stress of continuous movement under hostile conditions. Thompson made the command decision as the team leader. They would continue moving toward the mining complex, carrying O'Brien as long as medically possible. If he died during transport, they would carry his body rather than leave him for enemy forces. If the tactical situation became impossible, they would establish a final defensive position and fight rather than surrender. It was the decision that Sarah had expected from these men, and it reflected the values that had brought her to this place. The final phase of movement toward the mining complex tested every reserve of strength and determination that the team possessed. O'Brien died during transport, passing away quietly while Sarah held his hand as Chan and Williams continued carrying the stretcher. Sarah performed the heartbreaking task of pronouncing him dead while the team continued moving through increasingly difficult terrain. Turner's navigation proved accurate despite the challenging circumstances. The mining complex appeared in the distance just as the sun was beginning to set, its abandoned buildings silhouetted against the desert sky. But the facility was located on high ground that would require a dangerous approach across open terrain, and Sarah could see evidence of recent vehicle activity near the main buildings. The mining complex consisted of several large structures connected by roads and conveyor systems that had been used to transport ore from underground operations to processing facilities. Most of the buildings appeared to be in poor condition, with roofs collapsed and walls damaged by weather and neglect. But Turner had identified one structure that appeared to be intact and might contain the communication equipment they needed to contact rescue forces. As the team prepared for their final approach to the mining complex, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. She had entered the tunnel system hours earlier as a combat medic attempting to rescue 6 missing SEALs. Now she was part of a desperate escape and evasion operation that had cost the life of one teammate and left another behind in the underground ruins. The weight of those losses pressed heavily on her mind as she prepared for whatever challenges awaited them in the abandoned mine. The approach to the mining complex would require crossing nearly a mile of open ground under the cover of darkness. Enemy forces were known to be in the area, and the complex itself might be occupied by hostile personnel. Turner's reconnaissance had suggested that the facility was abandoned, but recent vehicle tracks indicated that someone had been using the site for unknown purposes. Sarah checked her remaining medical supplies as the team prepared for movement. She had enough bandages and medication to treat minor injuries, but nothing that would be effective against serious wounds. Her ammunition supply was limited to what remained in her sidearm, and she knew that the rest of the team was equally low on defensive resources. If they encountered significant enemy resistance at the mining complex, their options would be extremely limited. The death of O'Brien had affected everyone differently, but Sarah noticed that it had actually strengthened the team's resolve rather than weakening their determination. Thompson's leadership became more focused and decisive. Turner's reconnaissance became more thorough and careful. Chen and Williams worked together with increased efficiency and mutual support. They were no longer just trying to escape, they were fighting to ensure that O'Brien's sacrifice would not be meaningless. As full darkness fell over the desert landscape, the team began their final movement toward the mining complex and whatever fate awaited them there. Sarah carried O'Brien's identification tags along with her medical equipment, knowing that she might be the only person who could ensure that his family learned what had happened during these desperate hours in the underground tunnels and open desert. The weight of that responsibility added to her determination to reach safety and complete the mission that had started as a simple rescue operation. The mining complex looked like a monument to industrial decay as Sarah and the surviving SEALs approached under cover of darkness. Massive concrete structures loomed against the star-filled sky, their broken windows and collapsed sections creating an eerie landscape of shadows and geometric shapes. The main processing building stood 5 stories tall, its skeletal framework visible through gaps in the deteriorating walls. Rusted machinery scattered around the complex created additional obstacles and potential hiding places. Turner had identified their target, a smaller building that had once housed the mine's administrative offices and communication center. Unlike the processing facilities, this structure appeared to be largely intact, with most of its roof still in place and several windows that remained unbroken. More importantly, Turner had spotted what appeared to be an antenna array on the building's roof during his earlier reconnaissance. The approach to the administrative building required crossing an open area that had once been the main vehicle staging ground for the mining operation. The ground was covered with gravel and debris that would make silent movement nearly impossible. Enemy forces searching the area would easily hear footsteps on the loose stone, and the open space provided no concealment from observation by night vision equipment. Sarah stayed close to Thompson as Turner conducted a careful reconnaissance of the building perimeter. The team leader's breathing was labored, and she noticed that he was favoring his left leg during movement. When she questioned him about possible injuries, Thompson admitted that he had twisted his ankle during the tunnel evacuation but had not mentioned it because the team had more serious concerns to address. Now, hours later, the injury was becoming more problematic. Turner's report from his reconnaissance was both encouraging and troubling. The administrative building appeared to be unoccupied, and there were no signs of recent enemy activity in the immediate area. However, he had observed vehicle lights moving along roads several miles away, indicating that enemy patrols were still actively searching the region. More concerning, he had seen what appeared to be aircraft lights conducting systematic search patterns over the terrain between the mining complex and the compound they had escaped from earlier. The entry into the administrative building required careful coordination to avoid creating noise that might attract attention from distant enemy forces. Chen took responsibility for the initial breach, using his specialized training to disable an exterior door lock without triggering any alarm systems that might still be functional. Williams provided security while Sarah helped Thompson manage his injured ankle during the approach to the building. Inside the building, the team discovered a fascinating glimpse into the mining operations history. The administrative offices had been abandoned hastily, with documents and personal belongings scattered across desks and floors. Calendar pages showed that the facility had been evacuated nearly a decade earlier, but the communication equipment in the main office appeared to have been maintained much more recently. Someone had been using this facility as a communications relay point. Turner immediately began examining the radio equipment while Thompson established security positions for the rest of the team. Sarah used the opportunity to conduct a thorough medical assessment of everyone's condition. Thompson's ankle was severely swollen and would require immobilization if they needed to continue movement on foot. Chen had developed a persistent cough that suggested possible lung irritation from dust in the tunnel system. Williams appeared to be in the best physical condition, but Sarah noticed signs of exhaustion and dehydration that were affecting his judgment and reaction time. The radio equipment presented both an opportunity and a significant challenge. Turner determined that the system was functional and had enough power to transmit over considerable distances. However, the communication frequencies and encryption protocols were unknown, and attempting to broadcast on emergency frequencies would alert enemy forces to their location. The team needed to find a way to contact friendly forces without revealing their position to hostile listeners. Sarah remembered information that O'Brien had shared before his death. The wounded SEAL had mentioned transmitting a coded message before their original radio equipment was destroyed in the tunnel system. If rescue forces were indeed looking for them, they might be monitoring specific frequencies for additional transmissions. Turner began systematically checking emergency frequencies, listening for any indication that friendly forces were attempting to establish communication. After nearly an hour of careful listening, Turner finally detected what they had been hoping to find. A faint signal on one of the military emergency frequencies was repeating a coded message that matched O'Brien's earlier transmission. Friendly forces were indeed conducting search and rescue operations in the area, but they needed updated location information to coordinate an extraction. Turner began preparing a response that would provide their current position without compromising operational security. While Turner worked with the communication equipment, Sarah made a decision that she had been avoiding since O'Brien's death. She needed to return to the tunnel system to attempt Rodriguez's rescue. The wounded communications specialist had been left behind during the evacuation, and Sarah's medical oath required her to make every possible effort to save his life. Thompson initially opposed the plan, arguing that returning to the compound area was suicidal given the intensive enemy search operations. But Sarah's argument was compelling and aligned with the team's fundamental values. Rodriguez was alive when she had left him in the tunnel system, and he had provided crucial information that had enabled the rest of the team's escape. Abandoning him now would violate the same principle that had brought Sarah to the compound in the first place. If friendly forces were indeed organizing a rescue operation, they needed to know about Rodriguez's location and condition. Turner's communication attempts finally succeeded in establishing contact with the Rescue Coordination Center. The response was immediate and professional. A special operations rescue team was standing by to conduct an extraction operation as soon as they received confirmed location data and personnel accountability. Sarah's heart raced as she realized that their desperate escape might actually succeed. But the rescue coordinators also provided sobering information about their tactical situation. Enemy forces had identified the mining complex as a possible hiding place and were organizing an assault on the facility. The rescue team estimated that hostile forces would reach the complex within 2 hours, and they needed that much time to organize their own operation and reach the area. The timing would be extremely close, and any delay or complication could result in the rescue team arriving to find that the complex had been overrun. Sarah made her final decision about returning for Rodriguez based on this new information. The rescue window was too narrow to attempt a return to the tunnel system, and the risk of compromising the entire operation was too high. Rodriguez would have to be reported as missing in action, with the hope that he might survive long enough for a subsequent rescue attempt. It was another impossible choice that combat medics faced regularly, but the logic was clear even if the emotional cost was devastating. Thompson organized the team's defensive preparations while Turner continued coordinating with the rescue forces. The administrative building provided several advantages for a defensive stand: multiple exit routes, solid construction that would stop small arms fire, and elevated positions that offered good observation of the surrounding terrain. But it also presented significant vulnerabilities, including limited ammunition supplies and no heavy weapons to counter potential enemy armor or air support. Chen discovered something in the building's basement that changed their tactical situation significantly. The lower level contained storage areas that had been used to house mining explosives during the facility's operational period. While most of the explosive materials had been removed during the facility's closure, several cases of dynamite and blasting caps remained in a secured storage room. Turner immediately recognized the potential for using these materials to create defensive barriers or deny the facility to enemy forces if their position became untenable. Sarah's medical preparations for the final phase of their operation focused on treating injuries that team members might sustain during the anticipated combat. She organized her remaining supplies for maximum efficiency and identified locations within the building that would provide the best protection for treating wounded personnel. Thompson's ankle injury would severely limit his mobility during combat, so Sarah prepared materials for emergency immobilization that might allow him to maintain a defensive position. As the team waited for either rescue or enemy assault, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. What had begun as an unauthorized rescue mission had evolved into a desperate escape and evasion operation that had tested every skill she possessed as a combat medic and as a member of the special operations community. She had saved the lives of 4 SEALs but had been forced to leave 2 behind, and the weight of those decisions would stay with her for the rest of her life. The first sign of approaching enemy forces came from Turner's observation post on the building's upper floor. Vehicle lights were visible moving toward the mining complex along multiple approach routes, indicating that a significant force was converging on their position. The enemy had obviously determined that the administrative building was occupied and was preparing for a coordinated assault rather than a simple reconnaissance. Turner's communication with the rescue forces revealed that the extraction team was still 45 minutes away from the mining complex. Enemy forces would reach the facility in less than 20 minutes, creating a gap where the SEALs would have to defend their position without support. The rescue coordinators acknowledged the situation and promised to expedite their approach, but they could not guarantee arrival before the enemy assault began. Sarah took her position in the building's medical aid station, a small office on the first floor that provided protection from small arms fire while maintaining access to the defensive positions where her teammates would be fighting. She had arranged her medical supplies for immediate use and had identified the quickest routes to each position where wounded personnel might need treatment. Her sidearm was loaded and ready, but she hoped that her primary role would remain medical rather than combat. The enemy assault began with indirect fire that struck the larger buildings in the mining complex, sending clouds of dust and debris across the entire facility. The administrative building was not targeted initially, but the concussion from nearby explosions rattled windows and knocked equipment off desks throughout the structure. Thompson coordinated the team's defensive response while Turner continued his communication efforts with the rescue forces. Enemy ground forces approached the administrative building from 3 directions simultaneously, using the cover provided by mining equipment and other structures in the complex. Turner's elevated position allowed him to provide early warning and limited sniper support, but the team's ammunition situation made sustained combat impossible. They needed to conserve their limited resources for the final assault while maintaining enough defensive fire to discourage enemy reconnaissance. The first direct attack on the administrative building came sooner than expected. Enemy forces had determined that the building was occupied and began systematic suppressive fire against all visible windows and entrances. Chen and Williams returned fire from prepared positions while Thompson coordinated their defensive efforts despite his mobility limitations. Sarah remained in the medical station but could hear the intensity of the firefight increasing as more enemy personnel joined the assault. Turner's sniper fire was devastatingly effective during the initial phase of the battle. His elevated position and superior marksmanship training allowed him to engage enemy personnel who exposed themselves during movement between cover positions. But his ammunition supply was limited, and he was forced to choose targets carefully to maximize the impact of each shot. Several enemy soldiers were eliminated during the early assault, but Sarah knew that many more were available to continue the attack. The rescue forces finally announced their arrival in the area, but they were engaged in their own firefight with enemy forces that had attempted to intercept the extraction operation. The rescue team was fighting their way toward the mining complex, but their progress was being slowed by determined resistance from well-positioned enemy forces. Sarah realized that the final phase of their escape would require the SEALs to hold their position longer than originally planned. Thompson made the decision to use Chen's explosive discovery as a force multiplier for their defensive operation. The dynamite could be rigged to deny key approaches to the building or to create diversions that might disrupt enemy assault timing. Turner volunteered to prepare the explosive charges while maintaining his sniper position, demonstrating the kind of tactical flexibility that characterized special operations personnel. The second enemy assault was more coordinated and intensive than the first. Enemy forces had identified the team's defensive positions and concentrated their fire on specific windows and entrances rather than conducting general suppressive fire. Williams was wounded during this assault, taking a bullet through his shoulder that temporarily disabled his right arm. Sarah immediately moved to his position to provide emergency medical treatment while the firefight continued around them. Williams's wound was serious but not immediately life-threatening if treated properly. The bullet had passed through muscle tissue without hitting bone or major blood vessels, but the pain and blood loss significantly reduced his combat effectiveness. Sarah applied pressure bandages and administered pain medication while helping Williams adjust his fighting position to accommodate his wounded arm. Within minutes, he was back in the fight, using his rifle with modified techniques that compensated for his injury. Turner's explosive charges proved to be decisive during the third enemy assault. The charges had been positioned to collapse part of a structure that enemy forces were using for cover during their approach to the administrative building. When Turner detonated the explosives, the resulting explosion eliminated several enemy personnel and forced the remainder to seek alternative approach routes that exposed them to defensive fire from the SEALs' positions. The rescue forces finally reached the perimeter of the mining complex just as Sarah was beginning to worry that their ammunition would be exhausted before help arrived. The sound of automatic weapons fire and explosions from other parts of the complex indicated that a significant battle was developing between the rescue team and enemy forces. Thompson established radio contact with the rescue commander to coordinate their extraction from the administrative building. The extraction itself was a masterpiece of coordination between the trapped SEALs and their rescue team. Smoke grenades provided concealment for movement from the administrative building to an extraction point where helicopters could land safely. Sarah helped Williams move despite his shoulder wound while Turner provided covering fire from his elevated position. Chen assisted Thompson, whose ankle injury made rapid movement difficult. As the rescue helicopter lifted off from the mining complex, Sarah looked down at the facility that had served as their final refuge during the desperate escape operation. The administrative building was now burning from enemy fire, and explosions continued to rock the larger structures as the battle between rescue forces and enemy troops continued below. She thought about Rodriguez, still trapped somewhere in the tunnel system beneath the destroyed compound, and about O'Brien, whose body they had been forced to leave behind during the evacuation. The helicopter flight to safety provided Sarah's first opportunity to conduct proper medical treatment of Williams's gunshot wound and Thompson's ankle injury. Both men would require additional treatment at a military medical facility, but their injuries were manageable and should not result in permanent disability. Chen's respiratory problems from dust inhalation were also improving as he breathed clean air for the first time in hours. Sarah's own condition was a mixture of physical exhaustion and emotional trauma that would require time and professional support to resolve. She had completed one of the most challenging rescue operations of her career, bringing 4 Navy SEALs home alive from a situation where survival had seemed impossible. But the cost of that success included the loss of 2 teammates and decisions that would haunt her for years to come. The rescue helicopter carried them toward a secure military facility where they would undergo medical treatment and operational debriefing. Sarah knew that the debriefing would be extensive and difficult, requiring her to explain every decision she had made during the rescue operation. The military would want to understand how an unauthorized rescue mission had evolved into a successful extraction of personnel who had been written off as casualties. But, as Sarah looked at the 4 men whose lives she had helped save, she felt a sense of satisfaction that transcended the bureaucratic complications that awaited them. These SEALs would return to their families and continue their service because someone had refused to accept that they were lost. That knowledge would sustain Sarah through whatever challenges lay ahead, and it validated the decision she had made to enter the tunnel system and attempt an impossible rescue in the first place. The compound that had started as their destination was now completely destroyed, reduced to rubble and smoke by the enemy bombardment that had driven them into the underground tunnel system. Rodriguez's fate remained unknown, but Sarah held on to hope that he might have survived in some protected section of the tunnels and could be rescued during a future operation. The military would eventually mount search operations to recover both Rodriguez and O'Brien's remains, but that would be someone else's mission. Sarah's unauthorized rescue operation was complete. She had entered the ruins as a combat medic responding to a call for help from missing teammates. She was leaving as a combat veteran who had proven that sometimes the impossible was simply difficult, and that the bonds between special operations personnel transcended official orders and bureaucratic limitations. The SEALs she had brought home would never forget what she had done for them, and that knowledge would define the rest of her military career and her life beyond the service.